All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a highly partisan YouTube critique of Kamala Harris's alleged recounting of her presidential run, which they're calling 107 Days. Now, just to be totally clear up front, our job here isn't to take a political side or endorse any of these viewpoints. We are just neutrally breaking down exactly how this specific source constructs its argument, looking at the claims the video makes about the internal dynamics, the missteps, and the intense pressures of the Harris campaign.
So the source video sets a very specific, mocking tone right off the bat. The YouTuber explicitly states, "I read Kamala Harris's book, so you don't have to." And honestly, that makes their intention crystal clear. They're acting as a highly critical filter. The whole goal of the video is to expose what it views as the campaign's massive flaws, and ironically, they do this by weaponizing Harris's own recounted experiences and admissions right back at her.
To really understand how the source builds this critique without getting lost in all the political noise, we're going to follow the exact chronological arc of that 107-day campaign laid out in the video. We'll hit the Biden transition, the VP selection process, the media strategy and optics, and finally, those stressful final days.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the Biden transition.
The critique kicks off by examining the source's claims about Harris's initial transition into the nominee role, specifically her apparent reluctance to challenge Joe Biden's candidacy early on. There's a pretty stark contrast here. According to the book's perspective, Harris was allegedly complaining about Trump's communication style, while at the exact same time, she was terrified that telling Biden to step down would look like naked ambition or poisonous disloyalty to the White House staff. But the YouTuber completely flips that narrative. They counter by critiquing Harris's own communication as word salads, and they argue that Democrats recklessly hid Biden's health. Basically, the core argument here is that the campaign manufactured its own crisis through total inaction.
And the source uses this specific quote to really double down on that critique. The YouTuber argues the campaign was just utterly paralyzed by their deference to the Bidens. By treating the decision like a mantra and acting as if they were literally hypnotized, the source claims the campaign set a tone of internal friction and helpless passivity from day one.
Moving right along, we get to Section 2, the VP selection process.
Once the transition actually happened, the focus shifted over to the vice presidential shortlist. When breaking down the rejected VP candidates, the source points out what it perceives as deep hypocrisy and incredibly flawed political logic. For instance, the book allegedly claims Pete Buttigieg was rejected because America just wasn't ready for that specific demographic mix, which the YouTuber frames as a flat-out admission that Democrat voters are bigoted. Then there's Josh Shapiro. He supposedly wanted to be in the room for every decision. Well, the source is quick to point out the hypocrisy there, since that's exactly the privilege Harris demanded from Biden. And as for Mark Kelly, the campaign allegedly felt he was too untarnished. The YouTuber relentlessly mocks this, questioning how on earth a combat veteran and astronaut would somehow be too weak for a political campaign.
So who did she pick? According to the source, Harris selected Tim Walz based heavily on Bill Clinton's advice to pick someone as different as daylight and dark from herself. The YouTuber frames this choice as almost comedic, picking a candidate who was self-admittedly a poor debater, didn't use teleprompters, and was known for hogs and hunking, just to fulfill a superficial contrast rather than going with a highly decorated astronaut.
Okay, let's turn to Section 3, media strategy and optics. Now, the critique pivots away from internal personnel decisions and zeroes in on the campaign's media trail. Think about it. What happens when a candidate has a full 39 days to prepare for their first major sit-down interview? Well, according to the source, they still show up completely unequipped. The YouTuber visually highlights this gap to argue that despite having well over a month to get ready between day 1 and day 39, she was entirely unprepared when the moment actually arrived. And when that interview finally did happen, the video runs through a laundry list of Harris's own complaints about the physical setup. The lighting cast dark shadows, the chair angles were awkward, and her posture forced her to constantly look up at walls. But here's the real crux of the YouTuber's critique. They use her own admission that she chose not to micromanage her team to fix these super obvious issues as direct evidence of weak leadership and an inability to command a room.
And that brings us to this infamous quote from her appearance on The View. When she was asked what she would do differently than Joe Biden, this was her answer. The YouTuber flags this as absolutely the single worst mistake of the entire campaign, arguing that it effectively handed a massive, unforced gift right to her opponent's advertising team. To give you some context on exactly why the source frames that quote as so incredibly damaging, the video brings up this number. At the exact time she gave that answer on The View, Joe Biden's Gallup approval rating was sitting at a really dismal 39%.
And that low approval rating leads right into a rather blunt reality check. The source notes that campaign advisor David Plouffe allegedly had to intervene and sit her down to explain this reality in no uncertain terms, reportedly telling her, "People hate Joe Biden." The YouTuber highlights this claimed intervention to paint a picture of a candidate who was totally disconnected from actual voter sentiment. It's a pretty stark reminder of the reality distortion bubble that high-level campaigns can easily get trapped in.
Finally, we reach Section 4, the final days.
Here, the source transitions away from pure political strategy to look at the personal toll and the ultimate collapse of the campaign in its waning hours. To highlight the intense stress and, frankly, to mock her temperament, the video recounts this highly personal, somewhat bizarre anecdote from the book. It's a play-by-play of an eruption over bath towels being out of reach while her husband was watching a baseball game. The source uses this minor domestic dispute to argue that the candidate lacked the basic composure necessary to handle high-stakes, stressful environments.
The narrative then hits its climax on election night. Campaign chair Jen O'Malley Dillon delivers the fatal, definitive news. The source presents this emotional quote, "I could barely breathe, y'all." It's the moment the bubble bursts, the abrupt, crashing end of the 107 days.
The video maps out those final actions in the immediate aftermath. It notes her initial state of denial and bargaining the morning after, moving to the concession call a full day later, and concluding with her official certification of the election 62 days later, a constitutional duty she allegedly called one of her most difficult moments.
So what does this all mean? It leaves us to consider this final question. Through the lens of this source material, we see exactly how political literature attempts to shape history and humanize a candidate, while at the exact same time, highly partisan commentary actively works to dismantle and mock that exact same narrative using the candidate's very own words. It's a fascinating look at modern political media consumption. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the narratives in front of you.